Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film, as we look at the video worksheet that accompanies the movie Sergeant York. Number 2 shows men and women sitting in separate sides of the church, and at one point this was fairly common in many traditional churches in America. It did mostly fade away as the 20th century progressed, and in some cases even earlier, although there are still a few groups who practice it. Number 5 mentions the Cloche Hat, which has recently been invented in Paris and became especially fashionable after World War I, in part because it resembled the helmets worn by the soldiers in the war. And just as trench coats became a popular civilian fashion, modeled on the coats worn by the soldiers in the trenches, these ladies' hats that looked like soldiers' helmets became popular too. In particular, they were associated with the new women, or flappers, of the 1920s, who rejected many traditions of feminine modesty. Likewise, bloomers, women's underwear with separate leg holes, were becoming popular too, which was important in the 1920s as skirts got shorter and closer fitting. Now, number 6 and later number 67 both mention Cordell Hull, who, like York, was born in a log cabin in a rural Tennessee county close to the Kentucky border. At the time the movie is set, he was York's representative in Congress. Indeed, he would be in Congress almost continuously from 1907 to 1931, at which point he became a senator. 2 years later, in 1933, he joined Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet as Secretary of State and would later help form the United Nations, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Number 9 is really true. There were bars nicknamed Blind Tigers, located half in Tennessee and half in Kentucky. Alcohol at this point was illegal everywhere in Tennessee, except, I believe, within the city limits of Nashville itself. So having a bar with two sides would let Tennesseans enter the bar on their side of the line, then cross over into Kentucky. People in Kentucky running from the law could enter the Kentucky door and then go across the state line and stay in the Tennessee side of the bar. Number 12, we see the tree that says D. Boone killed a bar on the tree in year 1760. This was a real tree, although not actually in Fentress County, Tennessee, but rather in Washington County, Tennessee, in the area known as Boone's Creek. Where Daniel Boone really did go hunting in 1760, indeed hid in the creek from Indians who considered him a poacher. Now, the Boone tree was blown down in a storm in the early 20th century, in the 1920s, so shortly after the movie Alvin York is set. And there are some questions whether Boone actually carved this graffiti in the tree, as he was a fairly educated man who could probably spell words like bear and killed and his own last name. But it was a famous landmark for a long time. Now, number 14, where Mother York is spinning thread on a wheel, shows how many Americans, especially poor rural Americans, were still making clothes by hand even in the early 20th century, although by 1960 it's likely most people were using store-bought thread and cloth, not spinning their own at home. Number 16 introduces us to Zed Andrews, who's a fictional character, but interesting in terms of local history, because he's played by Robert Porterfield. This is one of his few film appearances, and by far his most famous film appearance. He is famous in the world of theater, though, for helping to found the Barter Theater in Southwest Virginia. Having been a starving actor in New York City during the Depression, he was in contact with people in his home in Southwest Virginia, where nobody was starving, but also nobody was getting to see theater. And he talked some of his fellow actors into moving to Abingdon, Virginia, and opening a theater where they could barter their talents for local food. Today, of course, the Barter Theater is the State Theater of Virginia. Number 18 refers to the bottom land that Alvin York wants. Bottom land, of course, was in the bottom of a valley alongside a river. Rain eroded the best soil off the mountains and down into the valley, and flooding in the rivers would deposit fertile soil along the river bottoms, making that land far more fertile and also flatter and less rocky, so it was easier to plow. much more valuable for farming than land on the top or sides of the mountains, and especially in days when most farmers plowed up and down the mountain, as York is shown doing, which made erosions even worse than later when farmers learned to plow along the side of the mountain, which was a little bit harder going, but reduced erosion. Number 22 shows us Alvin playing to win a shooting match, and shooting matches often worked like this, with people paying for a chance to take a shot and win the match. And York was a champion sharpshooter, although his actual turkey call may be fictional. Number 26, where York is hit by lightning on the way home from a blind tiger, is not at all how his salvation took place. Even when he was wild in his younger days, he did attend church, and his mother and minister both encouraged him to be a better man. One time when he came home drunk, his mother asked him why he couldn't be as good a man as his father and grandfather had been. And so he really spent several years thinking about his wicked behavior. Then a friend of his was killed in a bar fight, which shocked him so badly that he really began reconsidering his ways. And when he met Gracie Williams and began to fall in love, his reputation was so bad, her family wouldn't let the two of them meet. Finally, he was convinced by a preacher at a local church revival on New Year's Day, 1915, to change his ways. But that was a years-long process of salvation. But that's hard to show in a movie. The dramatic lightning strike is certainly quicker, easier, and more exciting. Which once he was saved, York became a Sunday school teacher, an elder in his church, eventually helped to found a new church, along with Rosier Pyle, and even took singing lessons so he could sing in church better. In number 29, we see Zed Andrews letting Alvin sharecrop his new piece of land. And this was a pretty common practice in the South mainly, although elsewhere too, where a poor farmer would work on someone else's land and pay the landowner a share of the crop he grew, rather than pay cash rent. This gave the sharecropper employment and a place to live. It gave the landowner labor he didn't have to pay for, in an economy where very few people had much cash money. But it often kept poor farmers trapped in a cycle of debt, as they borrowed money to buy supplies at the start of each year, hoping to pay that debt off when they sold their crops after giving a share to the landowner at the end of the year. But then they would have to borrow money again in the new year, often borrowing at least some of that from the landowners whose land they sharecropped, and keeping many trapped in a cycle of debt. Number 40, we see York's officers in the Army want to promote him to corporal so he can serve as an instructor in sharpshooting, which is true. Indeed, most of what they show in York's military career is pretty accurate, although a number of his fellow soldiers are fictional. Numbers 41, 42, and 43 all depict a religious discussion that really took place between York and his commanding officers, Captain Danforth and Major Buxton, although, of course, both of them in real life quoted more verses than just the ones shown in the movie or listed in the video worksheet. And number 46 is true. York was given a furlough to go home and think things over. Although had he chosen not to fight, they weren't actually going to let him leave the Army. They were going to find a non-combat role for him, as the Army did have some ways for people to work and have it counted as service without going into combat. They weren't real keen on doing that, but it was an option. People who refused even to do that, to serve even in some non-combat role, out of the objection that it supported the war effort, they were sent to prison, often treated very harshly. Some even abused to the point they died from the abuse. York, of course, did choose to serve in the Army, partly based on the Bible verse depicted in number 48, to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. But the verse that really convinced him was a selection read to him by Captain Danforth from chapter 33 of the book of Ezekiel. I have set thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore thou shalt hear the word at my mouth, and warn them from me, when I say unto the wicked, O wicked man, thou shalt surely die, convincing York that he could have a role as a watchman for his country. And at the time, there were times when the enemies of the Lord ought to die. Number 49 is true. York served in the All-American Division, as the 82nd Infantry Division was known. It was called the All-American Division because it had members from all 48 states. Its distinctive unit patch had 2 A's on it for All-American, and it's still worn by the 82nd Division today. Of course, today the 82nd is an airborne division. Number 56, and the battle scene in general, where York says that shooting Germans is like hunting turkeys back home. All that is, for the most part, very accurate. Although York did not really use a turkey call to get the Germans to stick up their heads, although he did get them one at a time, back to front, like shooting a flock of turkeys or ducks. Number 58, where Pusher is killed by a grenade, is not entirely true. Pusher is a fictional character, whereas all the other named characters in York's unit were real historical figures. It is true that a German who had supposedly surrendered, though, did throw a grenade at York's men, and that York shot him to teach the others a lesson. All that grenade did not actually kill anybody. And Pusher's death is there for the drama. Number 60, when a German officer points the way toward American lines and York goes the other way, that is true. York asked a German officer, actually a lieutenant, not a major as stated in the movie, which way to go, and when he pointed one way, York went the other, figuring the German officer was trying to trick him. I guess York called it correctly as he made it back to his own lines. Number 61 through 65 are all true. York did capture 132 men and later explained he'd done it by surrounding them. He did kill at least 28 men and silence 25 machine gun nests. Number 66, where the Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Force presents York with the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Commander-in-Chief of the AEF, of course, is Blackjack Pershing. Number 73, we see that York's wedding would be performed by the governor of Tennessee, and that's true. Governor Albert H. Roberts performed the wedding of Alvin and Gracie York. Governor Roberts would later become famous for playing a significant role in Tennessee ratifying the 19th Amendment, making us the decisive state and giving women the right to vote. Thousands of people came wanting to see York's wedding, but at the last minute, York decided to hold the wedding outdoors so nobody would be disappointed. And number 74 is partly true. Now, the entire state of Tennessee did not buy a house for Alvin and Gracie. Rather, the Nashville Rotary Club asked for donations and raised the money to buy a farmstead, but not enough to fully equip the farm. So York had to borrow money to get started with equipment and livestock and so forth. And the Rotary Club couldn't buy the farmstead outright. They took out their own mortgage to buy it. And during a big downturn in crop prices in the early 1920s, the Rotary Club couldn't continue making payments on the farm, and York couldn't cover his own debts either until a nationwide fundraiser was held to pay off the farm. And this would be one of several examples of York needing help to cover his various debts, sometimes for reasons not his fault, sometimes perhaps from poor management of his own money, often due to his extreme generosity towards local educational and religious causes. But this would be something that would haunt him throughout his life.